The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Lake as Jake Martinez stepped onto his cabin porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The peaceful silence was broken by the crunch of gravel as a black sedan pulled into his driveway. 3 people emerged, wearing matching polo shirts and stern expressions that immediately put Jake on edge. The woman leading the group had perfectly styled blonde hair and carried a leather portfolio like a weapon. Behind her walked a tall man with glasses and a shorter woman clutching a tablet. They approached with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you hold all the cards. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez," the blonde woman announced, without waiting for a response. "I am Patricia Williams, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. These are my board members Robert Chin and Lisa Thompson. We need to discuss some serious violations regarding your property." Jake set down his coffee mug and crossed his arms. The cabin had belonged to his grandfather and then his father before passing to him 6 months ago. He had been coming here since childhood and knew every trail, every tree, and every ripple on the lake. Whatever these people wanted, it could not be good. "What kind of violations?" Jake asked, keeping his voice level despite the irritation building in his chest. Patricia opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "Your property is in clear violation of multiple HOA covenants and restrictions. Your dock extends beyond the permitted waterline. Your cabin exterior does not meet our architectural standards. You have failed to pay HOA dues for the past 18 months. Most importantly, you are operating a short-term rental business without proper permits." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "I am not running any rental business. This is my family cabin. My grandfather built it in 1952, long before any HOA existed here. As for dues, I never agreed to join any homeowners association." Robert stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "All properties within Lakeside Estates are automatically subject to HOA governance, regardless of when they were built. Your grandfather may have built this cabin, but the HOA was established in 1987, and your property has been in violation ever since." "That is impossible," Jake protested. "My family has never received any HOA documentation. We have never attended meetings or voted on anything. We cannot just declare that we are members of an organization we never joined." Lisa looked up from her tablet with a smug expression. "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Mr. Martinez. The HOA filed all proper paperwork with the county. Your property is clearly within our boundaries. You owe 18 months of back dues plus penalties totaling $4,700. Patricia pulled out another document and thrust it toward Jake. "This is a formal notice to cure violations. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance, pay all outstanding fees, and submit to regular HOA inspections. Failure to comply will result in legal action, including possible foreclosure proceedings." Jake took the papers but did not look at them. His mind was racing. The cabin sat on 5 acres of waterfront property that his grandfather had purchased outright decades ago. The deed was clear and unencumbered. How could some homeowners association suddenly claim authority over land his family had owned for generations? "I will review these documents," Jake said finally. "But I want to make something clear. My family has legal ownership of this property free and clear. We've never been part of any HOA, and I question your authority to make these demands." Patricia smiled coldly. "Question it all you like, Mr. Martinez. The law is on our side. You have 30 days. After that, we will file liens against your property and begin foreclosure proceedings. The Lakeside Estates community has worked too hard to maintain property values to let one stubborn holdout ruin everything." The 3 board members turned and walked back to their car, leaving Jake standing on his porch with a stack of threatening legal documents. As their sedan disappeared down the gravel road, Jake felt a familiar fire building in his gut. It was the same feeling he had gotten in the Marines when facing impossible odds. Some battles were worth fighting no matter the cost. Jake spent the rest of the morning reading through the HOA documents. The legal language was dense and confusing, but the basic message was clear. According to these papers, his property was subject to dozens of restrictions covering everything from paint colors to lawn maintenance. The dues structure included monthly fees, special assessments, and penalties that seemed to multiply exponentially. What bothered Jake most was the map included in the paperwork. It showed the lakeside estate's development surrounding Pine Lake with clear boundaries that supposedly included his cabin. But something about the boundaries looked wrong. The map showed the HOA controlling the entire lake shoreline, including the large clubhouse on the eastern shore. Jake walked down to his dock and stared across the water at the imposing clubhouse. It was a modern structure with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wraparound deck that hosted HOA meetings and community events. Dozens of boats were moored at the adjacent marina. The whole setup looked expensive and exclusive. He pulled out his phone and called his cousin David, who worked as a real estate attorney in the city. After explaining the situation, Jake arranged to meet David the following day to review all the property documents. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one. That evening, Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson. This was his sanctuary, the place where he had learned to fish and swim and appreciate the simple beauty of nature. His grandfather had chosen this spot, carefully purchasing the land when it was still undeveloped wilderness. The old man had been a shrewd businessman who understood the value of waterfront property. As darkness settled over the lake, Jake noticed lights coming on in houses around the shoreline. The lakeside estate's development had grown considerably. Over the past decade, with million-dollar homes replacing modest cabins, the new residents clearly had money and influence. But Jake had something they did not understand. He had roots that went deeper than their property values and architectural standards. The next morning, Jake drove to the city with a box full of family documents. David Martinez shared his cousin's stubborn streak and had built a successful law practice by taking on cases that other attorneys avoided. His office was located in a restored Victorian building downtown, with Jake finding him hunched over case files when he arrived. "Let me see what these HOA people are claiming," David said as he spread the documents across his conference table. Jake watched his cousin read through the papers, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "This is interesting," David said finally. "They are claiming authority over your property based on covenants that were supposedly filed in 1987. But look at this legal description." He pointed to a section of dense text. "This boundary description does not match your actual property lines. In fact, it looks like they are claiming ownership of land that extends well beyond their actual development." Jake leaned forward. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means their legal foundation might be shakier than they think." David pulled out a large survey map and compared it to the HOA documents. "Your grandfather was very careful about his property boundaries. He hired a professional surveyor and recorded everything properly with the county. If this HOA is claiming authority over land they do not actually control, that could invalidate their entire case against you." David spent the next hour making phone calls to the county recorder's office and the State Land Commission. Jake listened to one side of increasingly animated conversations as his cousin dug deeper into the property records. Finally, David hung up and turned to Jake with a grin that reminded him of their childhood adventures. "Cousin, you are not going to believe what I just discovered. Your grandfather did not just buy 5 acres of waterfront property. According to the original land patent from 1952, he purchased the entire northern section of Pine Lake, including the lake bed itself, and approximately 50 acres of surrounding land." Jake stared at him in confusion. "That is impossible. The lake is huge. There are dozens of houses around the shoreline." David pulled out a faded document from Jake's box of family papers. "This is the original deed from the state of Montana. In 1952, the state was selling off large parcels of land to encourage development. Your grandfather bought what they called Parcel 47, which included mineral rights, water rights, and lakebed ownership. The legal description is very specific." Jake studied the old document with its elaborate script and official seals. "But if that is true, how did all these other people build houses around the lake? How did the HOA get established?" "That is where it gets interesting," David said. "It looks like there was a surveying error back in the 1960s when the first development started. Someone incorrectly assumed the lake was public water and began selling lots around the shoreline. By the time the HOA was established in 1987, there were already dozens of homes built on what should have been your family's property." Jake felt dizzy. "You're saying that all these people built their houses on land my grandfather owned?" "Not all of them. The southern and western shores were legitimately subdivided from other parcels. But the eastern shore, where the fancy clubhouse sits that appears to be built on your grandfather's land, if you own the lake bed itself, you have legal authority over the entire body of water. David called a surveyor and arranged for an emergency boundary assessment. While they waited, Jake tried to process what this might mean. If his family truly owned the lake and significant portions of the surrounding land, the HOA's claims against him were not just wrong, they were legally absurd. The surveyor arrived that afternoon with sophisticated GPS equipment and historical maps. Thomas Wilson had been doing boundary surveys for 30 years and recognized immediately that this was no ordinary property dispute. He spent several hours taking measurements and comparing them to the original land patents. Mr. Martinez Wilson said as he packed up his equipment, "Your cousin is absolutely correct. According to the original survey, your property extends far beyond what anyone has assumed. The lake bed mineral rights and water rights all belong to you. The eastern shore where that clubhouse sits is definitely within your property boundaries." Jake felt a strange mixture of vindication and responsibility. This was not just about defending his cabin anymore. He was suddenly the legal owner of one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the county. But with that ownership came the power to challenge an HOA that had been bullying property owners for decades. That evening, Jake returned to his cabin with a new perspective on the lake that stretched out before him. The water looked the same, but everything had changed. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of asserting his legal rights. The HOA had picked a fight with the wrong person. The law offices of Patricia Williams' legal team occupied the top floor of the newest building in town. When Jake and David arrived for their scheduled meeting, they were kept waiting in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Pine Lake. The irony was not lost on Jake that he was looking down at property he apparently owned. Patricia entered with two other lawyers and immediately took control of the meeting. "Mr. Martinez, I hope you have come to discuss payment of your outstanding HOA dues in compliance with our property standards. We are prepared to work out a reasonable payment plan if you acknowledge the validity of our authority." David opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the conference table. "Actually, we are here to discuss your organization's complete lack of legal authority over Mr. Martinez's property. We are also here to demand that you cease and desist from any further harassment of our client." One of Patricia's lawyers, a thin man with a perpetual scowl, leaned forward. "Mr. Martinez, your client's property is clearly within HOA boundaries. We have recorded covenants and 30 years of precedent. This is not a matter for negotiation." David smiled and pushed a document across the table. "This is a certified copy of the original land patent issued to Robert Martinez in 1952. As you can see, it grants ownership of the northern section of Pine Lake, including the lakebed water rights and approximately 50 acres of surrounding land." Patricia picked up the document and her face went pale as she read the legal description. "This cannot be accurate. There are dozens of homes around the lake. The county has been collecting taxes on separate parcels for decades." David pulled out the surveyor's report. "We had the boundaries professionally verified yesterday. Mr. Martinez legally owns the lake bed and significant portions of land that your HOA has been claiming authority over. In fact, your clubhouse appears to be built on his property without permission." The room fell silent, except for the sound of papers rustling. As Patricia's legal team reviewed the evidence, Jake watched their confidence drain away as the reality of the situation became clear. The HOA had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of property ownership for over 30 years. "This is impossible," Patricia said finally. "Even if these documents are authentic, there must be some statute of limitations. Our members have been paying taxes and maintaining their properties for decades. They have established legal rights through adverse possession." David shook his head. "Adverse possession requires open, notorious, and hostile use of property for a specific period of time. But your HOA has never openly claimed ownership of the lakebed or the eastern shore. You have simply assumed authority without legal basis. My client's family has been paying taxes on the entire parcel continuously since 1952. Patricia's scowling. Lawyer tried another approach. Even if Mr. Martinez owns more land than we realized, his property is still subject to HOA covenants that run with the land. The restrictions and dues remain valid regardless of property boundaries. David pulled out another document. Actually, the covenants filed in 1987 specifically reference properties within the Lakeside Estates subdivision. Mr. Martinez's property was never part of that subdivision and never subject to those restrictions. The HOA has no legal authority over land it does not control. Jake finally spoke up. What I want to know is how you convinced dozens of families to pay HOA dues and follow restrictions for property. Some of them do not even legally occupy. How many of your members realize they built their houses on land that belongs to someone else? Patricia stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. We'll be reviewing these documents with our own experts. Until then, Mr. Martinez is still subject to all existing HOA requirements. David gathered his papers calmly. Actually, Mrs. Williams, my client, will not be paying any HOA dues or complying with any restrictions. Furthermore, we will be filing legal action within 30 days to establish clear title to all property owned by the Martinez family. We will also be seeking damages for 30 years of harassment and illegal claims of authority as they left the law office. Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension.
Ow.
The legal battle was just beginning, but at least now he understood the true scope of what they were fighting for. The lake that had been in his family for generations was legally his to protect. The story of Jake's property ownership spread through the Lakeside Estates community like wildfire. Within days, his phone was ringing constantly with calls from HOA members demanding explanations. Some were angry, insisting that his claims were impossible. Others were worried about the legal implications for their own properties. Jake decided to hold a public meeting at the town hall to address the community's concerns. He was not looking for a fight with individual homeowners who had bought their properties in good faith, but he was determined to establish his legal rights and put an end to the HOA's bullying tactics. The town hall was packed on the evening of the meeting. Jake arrived with David and the surveyor Thomas Wilson, who had prepared detailed maps showing the true property boundaries. Patricia Williams sat in the front row with several other HOA board members, their expressions hostile and defensive. Jake stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd of concerned faces. Many of these people had invested their life savings in lakefront properties. They deserved to know the truth about what they had purchased and what rights they actually possessed. Good evening, everyone, Jake began. I know there has been a lot of confusion and concern about property ownership around Pine Lake. I want to share the facts as we understand them and answer your questions as honestly as I can. He nodded to Thomas Wilson, who began projecting maps onto the wall behind the podium. The surveyor explained the original land patents and how the boundaries had been misunderstood for decades. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the scope of the Martinez family's property ownership became clear. What this means, Jake continued, is that my family has legal ownership of the lake bed itself and significant portions of the eastern shoreline. We also own the mineral rights and water rights for the entire northern section of Pine Lake. This ownership has been continuous and properly documented since 1952. A man in the middle of the room stood up. What about our properties? Are you saying we do not own our homes? Jake shook his head. Most of your properties are on land that was legitimately subdivided and sold. Your ownership rights are not in question. However, some properties, particularly on the eastern shore, may have been built on land that was never legally separated from my family's original parcel. The room erupted in angry voices. People demanded to know how this was possible. Patricia Williams stood up and pointed an accusing finger at Jake. This is all lies and legal manipulation. Our HOA has operated legitimately for over 30 years. We will fight these claims in court and protect our members' investments. David stepped to the microphone. Mrs. Williams, your organization has been claiming authority over property. It does not control and collecting dues for services it has no legal right to provide. The Martinez family is not interested in disrupting the lives of innocent homeowners. But we will not tolerate continued harassment or false claims of authority. Jake raised his hand for quiet. Let me be clear about what I want. I am not trying to kick anyone out of their homes. I am not trying to destroy your community. But I will no longer tolerate threats and legal harassment from an HOA that has no authority over my property. If your organization wants to continue operations, it needs to do so within its actual legal boundaries. A woman near the back of the room asked what would happen to the clubhouse and marina. Jake looked across the room at Patricia Williams, whose face had gone white. It is something we will need to work out. The clubhouse appears to be built on my property without permission, but I am willing to discuss reasonable solutions that benefit everyone. The meeting continued for another hour, with emotions running high on all sides. Some community members were angry at Jake for disrupting their peaceful lake life. Others were furious at the HOA for misleading them about property ownership and legal authority. By the time the meeting ended, it was clear that lawyers would be the only winners in the legal battle ahead. Jake drove back to his cabin through the darkness, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had not asked for this fight, but he would see it through to the end. The lake that reflected the stars above had been in his family for 3 generations. He would make sure it remained protected for generations to come. The legal discovery process revealed decades of mismanagement and questionable practices by the lakeside estates. HOA. David's law firm subpoenaed financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence that painted a troubling picture of an organization that had operated with little oversight or accountability. The HOA had collected over $2 million in dues and special assessments over the years, much of which had been spent on legal fees and administrative costs rather than community improvements. The clubhouse that sat on Martinez's property had been built with member funds but without proper permits or property rights. Even worse, the HOA had been charging boat owners marina fees for docking privileges on a lake they did not control. Patricia Williams and her board had consistently rejected requests for financial transparency and had used legal threats to silence critics within the community. Several former board members came forward with stories of corruption and abuse of power that went back years. Jake found himself in the unusual position of being contacted by HOA members who wanted his help in reforming their organization. Many had been frustrated with the board's heavy-handed tactics and lack of accountability, but had felt powerless to create change. Now that the HOA's legal authority was in question, they saw an opportunity to demand better governance. One of the most vocal critics was Maria Santos, a retired teacher who had moved to Pine Lake 5 years earlier, seeking a peaceful retirement. She had clashed repeatedly with Patricia Williams over the HOA's restrictive covenants and arbitrary enforcement practices. "Mr. Martinez," Maria said during a phone call, "I want you to know that not all of us support what the board has been doing. Many of us have been trying to reform the HOA from within for years. Patricia Williams has turned our community into her personal kingdom, and we are tired of it." Jake appreciated her support, but he was focused on a bigger picture. The legal battle had revealed that property ownership around Pine Lake was far more complicated than anyone had realized. Several other parcels had boundary disputes or unclear titles that dated back decades. The county had been collecting taxes on properties that may not have been legally subdivided. David suggested that Jake consider a comprehensive solution that would resolve all the property disputes at once, instead of fighting individual battles. With the HOA and various homeowners, they could propose a master settlement that clarified ownership rights for everyone involved. The proposal David developed was elegant in its simplicity. Jake would retain ownership of the lake bed and water rights, giving him legal authority over the entire body of water. Properties that had been built on Martinez's land would be granted clear title through a quitclaim process in exchange for reasonable compensation. The HOA would be dissolved and replaced with a new organization that operated within clearly defined legal boundaries. Most importantly, the new community organization would be democratically governed with transparent finances and reasonable restrictions. Clubhouse would become community property, jointly owned by all lake residents. Marina fees would be eliminated since boat owners would have direct access rights to the lake. Jake presented the proposal at another town hall meeting, this time with the support of several HOA members who had grown tired of Patricia Williams's authoritarian leadership. The response was mixed, with some residents embracing the opportunity for reform, while others worried about legal and financial complications. Patricia Williams rejected the proposal outright, insisting that the HOA would fight Jake's claims in court regardless of the cost. She accused him of trying to steal property that rightfully belonged to the community and vowed to protect the investments of HOA members. But her support was crumbling as more details about the HOA's financial mismanagement became public. The organization had spent over $300,000 on legal fees in the past 5 years, much of it on frivolous lawsuits against community members, out-challenged board decisions. Meanwhile, basic maintenance on community facilities had been deferred while the board paid themselves generous stipends for their volunteer service. The breaking point came when David's investigation revealed that Patricia Williams had been using HOA funds to pay for personal legal expenses unrelated to community business. She had also approved contracts with vendors who had personal relationships with board members without competitive bidding or member approval. A group of HOA members, led by Maria Santos, called for an emergency meeting to remove Patricia Williams and her allies from the board. The meeting was contentious, with accusations flying from both sides, but the result was decisive. Patricia Williams was voted out as president, along with 2 other board members who had supported her authoritarian approach. The new board immediately reached out to Jake to discuss his settlement proposal. They recognized that the HOA's legal position was untenable, and that continued litigation would only benefit the lawyers while destroying the community they were supposed to protect. Jake worked with the new board and David to refine the settlement terms. The process took several months of negotiations, but eventually they reached an agreement that satisfied most community members. Jake would retain ownership of the lake and key parcels of disputed land, but would grant permanent easements for existing homes and community facilities. The HOA would be dissolved and replaced with the Pine Lake Community Association, a new organization with democratic governance and transparent finances. The clubhouse would become jointly owned community property, and boat owners would have guaranteed access to the lake without additional fees. Property owners who had built on Martina's land would receive clear title in exchange for modest compensation that would fund lake conservation and community improvements. The new association would focus on environmental protection and community building rather than restrictive covenants and architectural control. The settlement was approved by overwhelming majority vote of lake residents. Patricia Williams and her remaining supporters filed legal objections, but their challenges were quickly dismissed by the court. The judge praised the settlement as a creative solution that protected both property rights and community interests. Jake stood on his dock on the morning the settlement became final, watching the sun rise over Pine Lake. The water looked the same as always, but everything had changed. The lake that had been his family's sanctuary was now protected by law and community commitment for generations to come. The transformation of the Pine Lake community was remarkable. Without the heavy-handed restrictions and constant legal threats of the old HOA, residents began working together on projects that actually improved their quality of life. Volunteer committee organized lake cleanup days and installed new hiking trails around the shoreline. The clubhouse was renovated with community volunteer labor and became a true gathering place, rather than a symbol of HOA authority. Maria Santos organized monthly potluck dinners that brought neighbors together who had barely spoken during the years of community conflict. Children played freely on the beach areas that had previously been off-limits due to HOA regulations. Jake found himself serving as an informal mediator when disputes arose between neighbors. His ownership of the lake gave him unique authority, but he used it sparingly and always in consultation with the community association. His goal was to protect the natural beauty of Pine Lake while allowing residents to enjoy their properties without unnecessary restrictions. The marina was expanded and improved with slips available to all lake residents on a first-come, first-served basis. Boat owners no longer paid excessive fees to a private company, but instead contributed to a maintenance fund managed transparently by the community association. Jake also used his water rights to establish conservation easements that would protect the lake from overdevelopment in perpetuity. Working with state environmental agencies, he created buffer zones around sensitive wildlife areas and established water quality monitoring programs. The legal victory had given Jake something more valuable than money or property rights. It had given him the power to ensure that Pine Lake would remain the peaceful sanctuary his grandfather had envisioned when he first purchased the land in 1952. Patricia Williams eventually moved away from Pine Lake, unable to accept her loss of power and influence. The community she had tried to control with iron-fisted authority thrived without her divisive leadership. Property values actually increased, as potential buyers were attracted to the area's reputation for cooperative community governance. Jake often thought about his grandfather Robert Martinez, who had worked hard to purchase those 50 acres of Montana wilderness. The old man had understood something that the HOA board never grasped. True ownership was not about controlling other people, but about protecting something valuable for future generations. As autumn painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant colors, Jake sat on his porch planning improvements to the cabin that had been in his family for over 70 years. The HOA violations notice that had started this whole battle was framed. On his wall now, a reminder of how a small act of bullying had backfired spectacularly. David visited regularly, bringing his own family to enjoy the lake that had become a model for community cooperation. The cousins would sit on the dock sharing beers and marveling at how much their lives had changed since that morning when 3 HOA board members had tried to intimidate Jake into submission. The Pine Lake Community Association published an annual report that documented improvements to water quality, wildlife habitat, and community facilities. The report was distributed to environmental groups and community organizations across the state as an example of successful grassroots conservation. Jake had become something of a celebrity in property rights circles, with lawyers and activists seeking his advice on fighting abusive HOAs. He always told them the same thing: know your rights, understand your legal position, and never back down from bullies who abuse their authority. But mostly Jake enjoyed the simple pleasure of living on his family's land without harassment or threats. He could repair his dock without seeking permission, paint his cabin whatever color. He chose and welcomed guests without worrying about rental restrictions. The lake was his sanctuary once again. On quiet evenings when the water was still and the mountains reflected perfectly in the surface of Pine Lake, Jake could almost hear his grandfather's voice carried on the wind. The old man would have been proud to see his grandson protect the family legacy while building something even better for the community that shared their beautiful corner of Montana. The story of the HOA that tried to evict Jake Martinez from his own lake had become local legend. Visitors to Pine Lake often asked to hear the tale of how one man's determination to defend his property rights had transformed an entire community. But for Jake, the real victory was not in defeating the HOA or establishing his legal ownership. The real victory was in creating a place where families could build memories that would last for generations, just as his grandfather had done so many years before. The morning sun continued to rise over Pine Lake, casting the same golden light that had greeted 3 generations of the Martinez family. The water was clean, the community was strong, and the future was bright. Sometimes the best revenge against bullies was simply living well on the land you had always called home. Years later, when Jake had children of his own, he would bring them to the same dock where he had learned to fish and teach. The lake would be their inheritance, not just as property, but as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition might seem. The HOA had tried to evict Jake Martinez from his cabin, but instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant, who owned not just his small piece of paradise, but the entire lake and much of the land around it. Owner, they had lost everything they thought they controlled. Justice had been served not through revenge or retaliation, but through the patient work of building something better. Pine Lake had become a model community, where property rights were respected, neighbors cooperated willingly, and the natural environment was protected for future generations. Jake Martinez had won more than a legal battle. He had won the right to call Pine Lake home forever.
The last stand at Coyote Ridge, they slapped a cease and desist order on my ranch gate, like I was some cattle rustler who'd wandered too far from home territory. No conversation, no courtesy call, just a legal threat in bold red letters demanding I surrender my water rights within 21 days or face federal intervention. I nearly laughed because when someone drunk on development dollars thinks they can erase 4 generations with a court filing, You know you're about to witness the opening act of a Western that Hollywood couldn't script. Welcome to Mesquite Springs, where millionaires care more about golf course irrigation than century-old family ranches. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, front porch swing or air-conditioned subdivision. If you're into David versus Goliath tales where the slingshot's made of property deeds and righteous anger, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode, let's just say it makes today look like a friendly neighbor dispute. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I didn't come back to Arizona looking for a range war. I returned to Coyote Ridge Ranch to settle my grandmother Esperanza's estate, a woman who could outwork a mule and outstubborn a desert storm. She'd lived here for 80 years, knew every arroyo and mesquite tree better than her own weathered hands. I figured I'd spend a quiet month sorting through her things, maybe sell to a nice family who'd respect the land's history. Instead, I got ambushed by the Mesquite Springs Development Corporation, and their army of lawyers claiming my water rights were illegally grandfathered. They hated everything from my windmill to my adobe walls to the wild horses that still grazed my back 40. Apparently, heritage has no place in a master planned community with matching stucco walls and HOA, approved desert landscaping. Then came Bradford Sinclair, development VP and king of corporate condescension. He rolled up in a Tesla, waving environmental impact studies like they were eviction notices. This region has sustainability standards, he said, eyeballing my century-old irrigation channels like they were open sewers. I told him I wasn't planning on trading artesian wells for artificial lakes, just to match his country club fantasy. That's when he smiled, the way someone does before they call the sheriff on a perfectly legal campfire. He didn't see a neighbor, he saw an obstacle to his billion-dollar resort vision. There's a look some folks give when they think money makes their opinion law. Bradford wore that expression like it was tailored, along with his wife Victoria, the type who probably imports bottled water from Norway and considers herself an environmentalist because she owns 2 hybrid cars and a yoga mat made from sustainable bamboo. I figured it was just a misunderstanding, a weird, over-litigated misunderstanding. Then the legal notices kept coming. $$500 fine for non-compliant water usage, $$10 penalty for unauthorized livestock grazing, $2 500 citation for visual pollution via rustic structures, my personal favorite, excessive authentic character. Not kidding, they wanted to fine me for having too much soul. Imagine getting cited for being the only person in the valley with actual history. I started collecting these notices like baseball cards. Someday they might be worth something, if only as evidence in a trial for corporate terrorism. The war escalated when I discovered what Esperanza had hidden in her old cedar chest. Not just family photos and recipes, but original Spanish land grants dating back to 1847. Territorial water rights from before Arizona was even a state, and mineral claims that stretched deeper than their environmental lawyers had bothered to dig. My grandmother didn't just own 640 acres of high desert. She owned the underground river system that fed half the county, including the pristine aquifer Bradford's golf course designers were salivating over. The cherry on top, their proposed resort entrance sat squarely on land that had been in my family since before the Gadsden Purchase. Suddenly, I wasn't just the woman with excessive authentic character. I was the woman holding the keys to their kingdom, and they had no idea yet. The corporate cavalry moved fast, like predators sensing wounded prey. I got served with papers for a mandatory mediation hearing to discuss community water resource allocation and land use optimization. Translation: public humiliation disguised as negotiation. I showed up early, quiet, and armed with a leather portfolio that had belonged to my great-grandfather. Bradford held court. The head of the conference table next to Victoria and a shark-eyed woman introduced as Margaret Collins, corporate legal counsel. We pride ourselves on sustainable development, Bradford began, clicking through a presentation that looked like it cost more than most people's houses. Then there it was, my ranch on screen, photographed from the worst possible angle. I swear they waited for dust storm season and used a filter to make it look post-apocalyptic. This property, he said without even using my name, represents an impediment to responsible regional development. An impediment. No, a mirror. They just didn't like what it reflected. When the lawyer took over, the room got corporate, quiet. She explained too smoothly that continued non-compliance with county modernization standards could result in eminent domain proceedings if the greater good required it. That phrase, greater good, as if bulldozing someone's ancestral home was a public service. I kept quiet, but my pulse was hammering like a warning drum. They didn't know yet what I had discovered, and something Esperanza taught me years ago echoed in my head. Media, you don't show your aces until everyone else has folded. So I smiled, nodded, and said nothing, because while they were busy drawing battle lines in PowerPoint, I was sitting on Spanish land grants that could flip their whole damn development plan into legal quicks, and that night I spread Esperanza's documents across her old kitchen table like a treasure map. Every deed, every water rights certificate, every mineral claim felt like my grandmother whispering from beyond, "Don't let them pave over what we protected." The underground river deed was especially powerful, signed during the drought of 1956, when the water table dropped so low that underground streams could be legally claimed. Esperanza had done exactly that while others were drilling deeper wells and praying for rain. She was down at the territorial courthouse, staking claims on water that wouldn't surface for decades. They wanted sustainable water access. She'd bought the river beneath their resort plans. What they didn't realize was that the old woman had beaten them at a game they'd only just started playing. Their environmental studies were impressive, but their prized golf course design sat like a house of cards on private water rights. Their luxury spa, built on borrowed assumptions about aquifer access, was about to face some inconvenient truths. I didn't need to hire a PR firm or organize protests. I just had to walk into the right courtroom with the right folder. That's the power of Spanish land grants in a world run on corporate projections. 3 days later, I retained Maria Santos, the finest water rights attorney in Southwest, a woman who'd made her reputation defending indigenous claims against mining corporations. She took one look at Esperanza's documents and whistled low. "Elena," she said, "your grandmother didn't just protect a ranch. She secured a water empire." The hearing was set for the following month, time enough to let Bradford's people dig their own legal grave a little deeper. Because when you own the river under the oasis, you don't negotiate, you set the terms. And the terms were about to get very interesting for Mesquite Springs Development Corporation. Asterisk what happens when a century-old ranch holds the key to $1 billion development's survival when Spanish land grants meet corporate greed in a courtroom showdown that will determine whether heritage or profit controls the American West. Asterisk, asterisk, next episode, the water wars begin, and Elena discovers she's not fighting alone. She's leading an army of forgotten landowners whose ancestors planted flags the developers never bothered to see. Asterisk. Asterisk subscribe for more stories of legacy, land, and the quiet courage it takes to stand against those who mistake progress for bulldozers. Asterisk.